So let's look at in greater detail about the diversity that I'm talking about in the South Asia and Indian context. In India, we have you're aware that there are two national official languages, Hindi and English, and you have about 23 scheduled languages and about 230 languages in education and media, both print and electronic media, and more than 330 local vernaculars. So you see in the e-text there is a pyramid, picture of a pyramid showing this diversity. Several demographic and political factors obscure the actual multilingualism in India, because these numbers are hardly representative of the complexity of multilingualism we have. Because unless there are 10,000 speakers, a given variety is not even considered as a language by government. And this is a political factor. Hundreds of tribal languages, because of this reason, are left out of policy making process, because some of those tribal languages may not have 10,000 speakers. What about the notion of speech community? For South Asians, researchers have argued in India that speech community is based on shared space rather than shared language. People in our communities are open to negotiating diverse languages in their everyday life. We move on a continuum of monolingualism at home and bilingualism or even trilingualism as we go out of the house to go to work or in the leisure spaces. We keep switching from language to language to language. So it is in this context that to characterize bi and multilingualism in the Indian context, we can borrow a concept called language mode. It is shown in a picture form on the screen. Keep looking at the picture. The language mode here, they're saying to your left side, leftmost side, you have monolingualism. Rightmost side, you have bilingualism. And language A is the strong language, your mother tongue or base language or your native language, which is activated in your mind and therefore represented as filled boxes A. Okay. On the opposite side, you have degrees of blue. The first one, language B, is not at all active when you are in monolingual mode. And when you are in the intermediate mode, that is, the other person also knows two languages, your mind, both your own native language as A as well as language B are somewhat active, but not fully active. That's why it's less blue. And when you come to the rightmost side, you see again B language is also active along with your A language. Let me explain it a little bit more. So basically, language mode corresponds to a state of activation in the bilingual, the state of activation of the languages that the bilingual speaker knows at any given time. So this state is controlled by variables such as whom is this person speaking to or listening to, who's the interlocutor, and what is the situation, what topic are they talking about. All these factors influence whether both languages are active in your mind, two or three languages are active in your mind, or you are thinking and only your native language is active in your mind. In order to explain this activation of the various languages in the mind, this idea is proposed. So language mixing does not take place in position 1 in the figure that you have just seen. It does not take place because only one language is active in your mind. You can't mix. The other person doesn't know language B. So you will only continue to speak in language A. So there is no language mixing in position 1. In position 2, that is the intermediate position, speaker is in kind of using, of course the dominant language is his or her own mother tongue, but he is also trying to mix a little bit of language B. Because the other person also knows language B and they both are, but it is limited knowledge and therefore they are not switching to language B completely. Therefore, it is not completely activated. On the other hand, in position 3 of the figure, the speaker is in a totally bilingual mode where both language A and language B are active in his or her mind. And of course, B is slightly less activated than A because A is your mother tongue. But there is a lot of free code switching and code mixing between the speakers. And that is what is bilingualism. So if you look at it, bilingualism in this way, then what we need to understand is what do bi and multilingual speakers, what is their competence? What is the multi-competence that they possess? When you know only one language, you just talk about competence in that language. But when you know 2 or 3 languages, what is this multi-competence? Vivian Cook, well-known psycholinguist, has talked about this notion of multi-competence. And she says that it reflects knowledge of more than one language in the same mind. And one can test this multi-competence using online tests of language processing. And also, many psycholinguists argue that bilingualism is not a categorical concept. That is, you cannot classify people into bi or mono. It's not two-way distinction. There are degrees of bilingualism. So language acquisition. Now the next point is, okay, these are some of the concepts surrounding bi and multilingualism, both in the West as well as in the Indian context. Now moving on to the notion of what are the implications of this to understanding language acquisition. Now researchers have shown infants as young as 0 to 4 months are able to, distinguish, discriminate speech sounds by looking at face and by listening to the speech spoken to them. They are able to distinguish native phoneme, the contrast pa from ba, if both are meaningful in their language. They know which sound can occur after which sound. It's called phonotactics. They have some knowledge of phonotactics. They are able to associate words with certain objects, word-object association. And then they slowly also learn phonological categories, can guide them to learn more and more related words. So, bilingual language acquisition process involving, let's say, t and d. So, the sound d, when you hear, or when a Hindi speaker hears a word like doll, right? For a bilingual Hindi-English child, the sound da elicits 2 different percepts in the mind. Because in Hindi, there is a distinction between da and da. Da as in dal, lentil, versus da, dal, that is branch. In Hindi, you have to hear those sounds differently, da and da. Whereas for English, da is da, that's it, there is only one percept, right? For English children, when they hear doll, they hear just one percept, da, doll, that's it. They don't have dha. So then, what are some of the factors which influence bilingual language acquisition? So in addition to native phonemes, you also have how often those phonetic tokens occur in a given language. So are dha and da, do they occur with equal frequency, or is one more frequent than the other one? In addition to frequency of occurrence of phonetic categories, certain contextual clues from the environment also influence language acquisition. Further, domain general abilities, that is general cognitive abilities like attention and memory also influence language acquisition. And in addition to these factors, you also have opportunities for using the languages. Now, if a Telugu child or a Hindi child is growing up in an American English environment, they are put in a daycare center and they spend most of the time with English children. They won't have as many opportunities to distinguish native phonetic categories. Their mind will tune to English sounds, English categories. So opportunities for learning and using languages also influence one's bilingualism, how proficient or not one is. So children when it comes to word level, there are occasions when children take roots from one language and add inflections from another language. Okay, and of course, gradually they learn that the root belongs to English and the inflection is Hindi, and they should not mix the two. Code separation happens gradually. So, what kind of language processing research has taken place on bilinguals? The first requirement in conducting research on bilingual language processing is to figure out which of the two languages is dominant in the mind of this person, the participant. This is done using language use history questionnaires. You have to make them fill up a questionnaire by asking questions about when they started learning and using their various languages, how early in their life, and whether they learned those languages naturally in a playground or through instruction in a foreign language classroom, how they learned, and with whom they speak which language and which domain. So all these details must be obtained before you conduct an experiment on bilingual language processing involving adults. How Spanish L1 and English L2 participants process idioms. You know, processing idiomatic expressions are really not that easy. Literal language is much easier to process than idiomatic expressions. So, there is one very recent study that conducted this year, 2014, where they used English idiomatic expressions like, you will see it on the screen, a piece of cake, get off the ground, sweep under the carpet, red tape, night owl, rip off, put down. You know, these expressions have both literal meaning as well as figurative meaning. Whether one can grasp figurative meaning depends upon when one has learned English. So, late bilingual, if one is a late bilingual, they might think of the literal meaning, but if one is an early bilingual, they have been exposed to English for a long time, they can access both literal as well as figurative meanings. So, there are ways of testing online comprehension of idioms. So, in this study, for instance, they used eye tracking methodology, and they used both early and late Spanish-English bilinguals, and they monitored their eye movements and duration of fixation were recorded while they were reading ambiguous English sentences containing idiomatic expressions. Results of this research reveal that literal meanings were activated faster in less proficient, that is, bilinguals. On the other hand, supportive context, if suppose the sentence gave some clues, it influences the eye movements also. So, English dominant bilinguals did not exhibit differences in accessing literal and figurative meanings. So, if they were early bilinguals, they were able to access both literal meaning and figurative meaning much faster. There were no major differences in the parameters that were measured using eye tracking. So, in other words, how do we understand language dominance? It is important to develop language use histories in relation to our languages to see which language a person is using in majority of the domains in their day-to-day lives. In our context, it is not always clear to say what is one's first language or dominant language or mother tongue, and which is the second language, which is the third language. It's not very easy because many of us grow up learning 2 or 3 languages simultaneously. We are exposed to 2 or 3 languages at once. It's not that we are exposed to one language at home only and speak another language only when we leave the home. So, if we are able to differentiate bilinguals into proficient and less proficient groups, we can begin to conduct eye tracking studies of language processing in relation to Indian languages. So, that is one of the major challenges that cross-linguistic research has shown, that come up with tests to differentiate bi and multilinguals into proficient and less proficient users of those languages, and shown that come up with tests to differentiate bi and multilinguals into proficient and less proficient users of those languages, and conduct online experiments to see how fast they can grasp meanings. So to conclude today's lecture, I have tried explaining some of the concepts which dominated the field of bilingualism based on English speaking countries. But I pointed out that in South Asian context, and in particular in the Indian context, some of those concepts are irrelevant or not adequate, and that we need to go beyond talking about L1 and L2 as though they can be separated easily. And we have to come up with tests of establishing dominance in our language. Thank you. Now, if you have any doubts, please consult the e-text and the additional readings provided in the content. Thank you.